So today I have the pleasure of having Joe Consorti on the show. Joe, thanks so much for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, absolutely, Stefan. Thanks so much for bringing me on. I'm really, really excited to chat with you today.
Awesome, thanks. Um, so actually, I'd love to start, as the name of the show implies, Bitcoin journeys. I'd love to start for you, wherever you think is relevant, at the beginning of your Bitcoin journey. So if you could tell me a bit about how you first discovered Bitcoin and what that initial encounter was like.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll take this back to the beginning of college. I ended up going to the school that I went to because I wanted to become a doctor. I didn't intend to go in for business or kind of what I'm doing now, which is corporate finance related at Theya and now Horizon. I initially wanted to go to this particular school because they had a great on-site hospital. It's an on-site hospital that I ended up getting my appendix removed at about 6 months later. But regardless, I went there because of this on-site hospital. I wanted to become a doctor. During orientation, I decided I want to go into corporate finance. The reason I did was because I figured I want to talk for a living, and being in business, and especially being in a field that's as complex and complicated and requires good speakers like corporate finance, I figured I would give that a shot. And also during high school, I was in the business club, and I spearheaded that. I ran competition prep. So basically, like my MO throughout all of high school was helping students basically prep for these mock business cases. I competed in them myself. I won and went to nationals for all 3 years that I did this club, which was extremely fun. And so, in high school, I learned that I had this skill. I wanted to leverage it in college. I wanted to go to school to be a doctor. I went to this particular school because I wanted to be a doctor. I ended up switching into corporate finance. And thank goodness they turned out to have a very good business school as well. So, I'm going to this school, and about 1 month after we get back from winter break, like one and a half months of my freshman year, it's spring break. They send us home for spring break, and then COVID hits. And our school shut down for COVID, and they didn't let us return from spring break, and they didn't let us come back to the dorms to get our stuff. And so that right then and there made me pretty wary and skeptical of like central authority. I didn't know what to call it at the time, but it made me very mad that someone from the top down could enforce a decision like not allowing me to get my computer or my clothes and having to leave it in the dorm for something that I largely knew then, but we know now was certainly not as accidental as they said it was, right? And so given that, that's kind of where my healthy skepticism towards higher power, centralized authority came into play. And so basically from there, they had given us access to Bloomberg terminals in the library. And one of the things I became fond of very early was just playing around in it, learning how it worked. There was all this data at my fingertips. I could look up, all the information I needed to know about any particular corporate bond issuance going all the way back to the, 60s and 70s. That's extremely cool. I get the most up-to-date, in real-time data about basically all global equities, all global bonds, corporate and sovereign. And so much data here, I became really obsessed with learning how to use it. And so that's what I was doing in the lead up to spring break, was I was playing around with the Bloomberg terminal and familiarizing myself with it. They sent us home for spring break. And so that's where I kind of developed my love for financial markets and, how everything kind of fit together, how this grand puzzle piece, how this grand puzzle fit together. And so they sent us home for spring break. That summer, I decided to get a bunch of my friends together and run a painting company. We had a lot of time on our hands for about 2 weeks. My school wasn't even doing classes. And then they began doing classes again, but it was totally virtual. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to record all my classes, watch them afterward if I need to, do the reading, ace the exams. And so that's what I did. I just didn't watch the lectures, did whatever reading I needed to do, ace the exams. And it also made me very disenchanted toward college in general, right? For things like complex business degrees, engineering degrees, and obviously medicine. being in college is a necessity. But right now, and I only found this out after I was further down my journey, but obviously we live in a centrally planned economy. Interest rates are chosen from the top down. When the Fed and other global central banks have been basically hammering interest rates artificially down to the zero lower bound for like 15 years at that point, to this point, right? 15, 16 years, actually 17 years now. Then what you get is this huge misallocation of capital. Rates are zero. What do we have to do? We have to extend loans to as many people as we possibly can with a pulse so we can make money on an origination fee, because we're not going to make any money from the loan, right? And so that's why basically student loans began getting extended to anyone with a pulse. Doesn't matter if they're going for a worthwhile degree. It used to be such that not only was college inexpensive, right, as a function of all these student loans not being extended, but also it's sorry, my mom's calling. I'll text her in a second. Not only was college inexpensive as a function of that, but also because only with these worthwhile degrees existed. The rise of zero interest rate policy gave way to an insane amount of student loans, which then gave way to more colleges opening up and the price of college admissions increasing. And so that's a side topic, but it's a symptom of this larger problem, which is zero interest rate policy and artificially manipulated interest rates. And that's one of the reasons I got into Bitcoin. But yeah, so over the summer, that's what I did. I ran that painting company with a bunch of my buddies, made a decent amount of money for an 18-year-old. I was 19 at the time. I had turned 19 over the summer. And I didn't know what to do with it. I had been studying financial markets, a lot of stuff I could have done with it. Do I buy treasuries and get, at the time, like 0.25%? Do I buy corporate bonds and get, 3.5%? Do I buy, right? What do I buy? Do I buy something in the risk bucket? I wasn't even considering Bitcoin. Then my friend, who works at BTC Inc., came to me and basically said, yo, have you heard of Bitcoin? Look at what Bitcoin's doing. Here are some reading materials. He basically gave me two things to read, those being The Masters and Slaves of Money by Robert Breedlove and The Bullish Case for Bitcoin by Vijay Boyapati. Every podcast I go on where people ask me, what's your story? Which I love talking about, because everyone's story is different. I always mention those two pieces of literature because those are what orange pilled me. Basically, The Masters and Slaves of Money had synthesized all of the feelings I was feeling over this year, getting kicked out of school, by the central authority, having no say in it. And then it brought it together to say, okay, this is actually what's causing all of this. It's the money. And then The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, kind of the flip side of that. Here's the solution, right? So those two materials got me orange pilled. I poured basically everything I had earned that summer into Bitcoin. Great idea, because at the time, Bitcoin was like $8,000, $9,000. That was before its huge run into 2021. And so that's how I initially came to Bitcoin. How I began working in Bitcoin. From there, basically what I had started doing was I got hooked, right? I came in because I had a lot of money. I came in mostly for number go up, but also, for the ethos of the asset itself. It's something I really bought into, because it lines up with my own political views, my religious views. I'm a devout Christian. And so it made me want to learn more and put more of my time into hopefully providing value to other people. And so what I had been doing up to that point was like a year and a half worth of self-teaching on the Bloomberg terminal. I loved striking charts. I loved analyzing them. I just started doing that on Twitter around late 2021. So I've only been on Twitter for about 3 years and 5 months. So 3 years and 5 months ago, I started putting these charts out into the space, right? And just putting some commentary with them. I started doing like a weekly roundup called This Week in Bitcoin Data or Last Week in Bitcoin Data. I can't remember exactly. But it was basically a collection of Bitcoin and global macro charts with some analysis. A friend of mine, Matt Snow, he had reached out, Nick Bhatia, right, a friend of his, had reached out to him saying, hey, do you have any research analysts in mind, someone who could work underneath me as a research analyst? I want to turn my newsletter, the Bitcoin Layer, into a fully fledged company. I want to start a YouTube channel. I want to scale my research effort. and Matt Snow had followed me. And he had followed me off the word of my friend who had introduced me to Bitcoin. So basically the chain of command, when Nick asked Matt Snow if he knew anybody in the space who could do this research analyst thing, Matt Snow went to my friend, who knew that I had started doing this and who had introduced me to Bitcoin. And then he referred Matt Snow to me. And so basically, right, the same person who introduced me to Bitcoin also helped me land the first job I ever had in Bitcoin, which was a research analyst working with Nick Bhatia over at the Bitcoin Layer. And so basically we met. I took a breakout room in my school. We hit it off right away, and I started working for him right then and there. At the time, it was a 2-man company. A day later, it was a 3-man company. We hired on our design lead, Matt Ball, who's still with us. And since then, we've managed to scale the Bitcoin Layer from a 1-man newsletter that was about 4,000 subscribers in size to a 7-man operation, 25,000 subscribers strong on Substack, close to 30,000 subscribers strong on YouTube, and a brand new institutional product called TBL Research that I'm spearheading for institutional clients. And so that's kind of how I began. I went from first knowing about Bitcoin, finding out about it, like the story that led up to it, and then how I started working in the space. And those two are very much connected.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating story, and a lot to uncover there. And I appreciate the detail as well. One thing I'm curious about. So, I know we talked a bit about the pre-story to when you were in school and when the COVID lockdowns happened, and you kind of having this moment of questioning authority and questioning why this is allowed, that you're not able to even retrieve, your basic things from your dorm, to then, articles like Masters and Slaves of Money, which I know for me also was super influential in the beginning of my Bitcoin journey. And what I'm curious about is, there's a big, obviously, freedom element that's associated to Bitcoin. And I think what draws a lot of people to it in the beginning. Was that for you, was that the main value proposition that you saw in the beginning, or what really stood out to you as like, wow, this is revolutionary?
Yeah, it was only after actually learning about the monetary properties and then becoming convinced to buy a lot of it, that then after I did that, I thought I should do some digging, which is not what I would advise. Well, I did my due diligence, right? I did the due diligence I needed to, which was, what are the monetary properties of this thing? And once I figured those out, once I did, several hours of research on that, I was comfortable at 19 aping basically like all of my money into it, which turned out to be a great decision. And then along the way, along that ownership journey over the next couple of months, I then began to appreciate more the freedom aspect of these things. But more so like, what I appreciated more than the freedom aspect of it was that Bitcoin ultimately solves for the biggest problem that we have in the world today, right? Which is globally centrally manipulated interest rates. If one entity from the top down can artificially set the cost of capital, which is literally our main communication mechanism, more than language, because obviously that needs a translator. Everyone in the world speaks in money, okay? And if a series of 20 or 10 or 7 global central banks have an outsized amount of influence in basically saying, all right, I'm going to set the price of money. I'm going to artificially control your communication mechanism. And in doing so, I'm going to distort everything. I'm going to distort global trade. I'm going to distort the actual price of goods. I'm going to distort your standard of living, right? Because by artificially keeping rates low, it discourages really, really worthwhile investment. It just encourages people to throw money at anything for any reason. And so it makes goods not just more expensive, but it makes them of lower quality, right? Because the type of investment is much worse and the price of goods are going up, right? So it makes life more expensive and less in quality. Refrigerators from the 50s still work today, whereas your fridge from 2010, I bet broke 5 years ago, right? And so that's the main problem I was really, really excited about and as I started working with Nick, I began to understand even more. I understood this at a tertiary level, but I began to understand even more that the key driver, right, as I mentioned, is rates. The key driver of the world economy is rates. Many people will look to the Fed. Many people will look to companies or even equity prices. Those all come after what rates in the U.S. Treasury market are doing, right? Based on that behavior, the Fed makes its decisions, not the other way around. It's a reflexive relationship, but more often than not, the rates market moves first. And it gets hugely distorted by an entity like the Fed, who's basically saying, I'm going to set the price of money. You guys can do what you want, but I'm going to set the price of money. And so instead of this risk-free rate getting to do what it should be doing, which is moving up and down as actual creditworthiness rises and falls in the economy with business cycles, and actually tightening and loosening lending conditions based solely on that, the Fed comes in and throws a wrench into all of it. And so I really gained an appreciation for that, and I realized how Bitcoin solved for that problem, and it's the only thing that can solve for that problem. Because with Bitcoin, nobody controls it. There's no central entity that manipulates it or touches it or influences its price in an outsized way. It's just a bunch of buyers from all around the globe, a bunch of miners that are maintaining this rule set, a bunch of computers who are maintaining this rule set, a bunch of miners who are creating new units of this thing, none of which can be tampered with, right? If a node decides that it wants to do something different, it gets booted off the network. If a miner decides, I'm going to, I won the block, I'm going to increase the issuance to 6, right, Bitcoin instead of 3.125, they get kicked off the network, right? That doesn't happen with the Fed or any other central bank, right? It is pure monetary policy. It is pure unadulterated monetary policy. And so that's really what I fell in love with Bitcoin, what I figured out it solved for, and why I'm still so passionate about it to this day. Yeah, that would be kind of my answer there.
Well, I mean, I think you do a really, really great job of explaining those oftentimes difficult concepts into something that's easy to understand. And, I think that's also, well, my podcast is geared also towards beginners, towards people who are trying to understand Bitcoin and to understand how it works. And I think a bit the duality that we have right now is that we have two competing systems, essentially, or I'd love to hear your view on it, right? We have the fiat system, which is indeed controlled, centralized system, and we have Bitcoin, which there are no rulers, and it's completely decentralized. My question is, as we go forward in time, and, I think especially lately, the political developments, of course, have been interesting around Bitcoin, especially in the US, but how do you see those two systems interplaying going forward into the future?
Yeah, so Bitcoin and politics is interesting. I'm having a lot of fun with it personally. I'm a big Trump guy. I'm a huge advocate for Trump. I have been since 2016 when I was a freshman in high school and I couldn't vote, and I still am today. Reason being, he is in a very similar way to Bitcoin. He's kind of unencumbered by the system that came before him, right? He isn't a career politician, right? And there's an extreme amount of utility in that when it comes to fixing a system, coming from the outside in, not needing any donors' money. He still takes it, so he doesn't have to spend his own, but not needing it, right? That's a huge advantage. You are unencumbered not only by a career that depends on being a politician, but the money that comes from it. He was a businessman. He doesn't need their money, and he has experience in running a multi-billion-dollar multinational company. People can rag on it all day long and say that, wow, his business was this and that and the other thing. But the amount of those people who've actually run a multi-billion-dollar multinational company is probably zero, who are ragging on him. There's probably a handful of people who have ground to stand on when it comes to that kind of criticism. And so he's very similar to Bitcoin in that way. He's unencumbered by the system that came before him. He's completely different, right? And in doing so, he's the only person that can kind of fix what we're going through. And he's doing it actively, right? In my home state of Massachusetts, there have been thousands of arrests of illegal migrants from Brazil and Venezuela who have come here to human traffic, to murder, commit other heinous crimes that I cannot say on Spotify or YouTube, and do terrible things, right? Why are they in Massachusetts? Why are they in the state that held some of the greatest battles of the Revolutionary War and helped found this nation? Why are they here, right? He's fixing that. And a litany of other things that need to be done, but other politicians who need to maintain their political credibility so they can continue their career won't do. So he's saying, I don't care. I'm not going to be here for another term. This is what the people voted me in for. I'm going to do it. In the same way, Bitcoin, right? It does not care what other people think. It doesn't care. It's completely neutral, monetary policy that cannot be altered. It's totally unadulterated and unadulterable from any outside forces. It exists. It's the way that it is. If you want to change it, you can't. Good luck. You have to reach consensus in order to make changes, and do things like soft forks. But even now, as Bitcoin is scaling at such a rapid rate, it's going to be difficult to change Bitcoin at all, right? In just a couple of years, it'll be basically impossible to do it. And so in the same way, Bitcoin has come into this system that is destroying people's lives, and is basically functioning in a way that says, I don't care. With Trump, it's personality. With Bitcoin, it's total cryptography, right? You cannot change this thing. And so for me, like it's very interesting. These two technologies line up quite a bit. So I'm very passionate about technologies. These two things line up quite a bit more than people would think. I'm very passionate about Trump. I'm very passionate about what he's doing for our country, and I love Bitcoin, right? And so seeing all of this stuff happen, it feels like a fever dream, right? A strategic Bitcoin reserve in law, right? Executive order signed into law. That's insane. The fact that he was shrewd enough to make it so he doesn't need congressional approval by making all future Bitcoin purchases budget neutral. That means no new money will get spent, and the stuff he's selling, he doesn't need authorization to sell from Congress. Therefore, he doesn't need congressional authorization to buy Bitcoin. That's extremely shrewd. Like someone who doesn't care about Bitcoin and was just saying, all right, I'm going to appease this one voting bloc because they promised to vote for me because I talked about this thing. A guy who was acting that way would not include that in his executive order about it. Right? He just wouldn't. He would be much more lazy in the way that he put together this executive order than he did with it right now. And in my view, the people Trump has surrounded himself with to spearhead this operation, the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, really understand Bitcoin, and they understand its utility for the United States government, not just from a immense place of geopolitical importance, but also what it can do for our national debt, right? Our standing in the world. And so it's incredible, not just that he did this, but also that the people he surrounded himself with understand this and understand the urgency required with acquiring more Bitcoin. So it's, Bitcoin, whether people like it or not, it is political. A lot of people view it as libertarian. I'm of the mindset that Bitcoin isn't as libertarian as it is like avowedly right wing. Because of what Bitcoin enables you to do. Obviously, the technology itself is very much libertarian, right? Nobody can do anything to it, right? Obviously, don't tread on me, right? You could just say that that's a Bitcoin phrase and somebody would believe you. But I do believe that what it allows you to do makes it far more right-wing than libertarian, right? It allows you to raise a family much more easy. It allows you to start a family much more easy, right? If your savings vehicle is Bitcoin, if the entire United States, if their savings vehicle is Bitcoin, I guarantee you the total fertility rate in the United States would rise from 1.6, which it currently is, which is below replacement rate, back up to 2.1 in like a decade, right? Because their savings vehicle is Bitcoin. Now having children isn't as out of reach as it was before. And most young guys, the reality is we want to start families. Right. But it's increasing out of reach. And so what do? We resort to things like playing video games all day. We resort to things like smoking weed and going out to bars. Whereas what men want to do in their heart of hearts, right, is do hard things, provide value, and start a family. And they can't do that. But I guarantee you, if all the United States saved in Bitcoin, we'd be able to raise our total fertility rate. And so that's what I believe Bitcoin allows you to do, makes it a much more right-wing asset than a libertarian asset. But regardless of all of these things, Bitcoin is for everyone, okay? It's for the people who hate Donald Trump, right? There are many in the space. There are a lot of left-wing people in the space, which I don't understand how, personally. But, they're in Bitcoin. It's for them too. It's whatever. Whoever wants it can own it. In the same way, regimes that we totally disagree with, China, right? They can own Bitcoin as much of it as they want. Russia, they can buy Bitcoin as much of it as they want. That's the beauty of Bitcoin, right? Its properties allow for abundance and widespread human flourishing and prosperity per capita to increase. But at the same time, anybody can buy it, right? Anyone can own it. Nobody can tell you can't own it, right? Because even in places where it's illegal, you could store it in your head, right? So that's kind of where I view the intersection of Bitcoin and kind of the political sphere. It's really cool and really interesting to see the way that it's heating up. It's amazing to see the United States recognize the geopolitical strategic importance of Bitcoin, and seeing people like Matt Pines and David Zell and Grant McCarty at the Bitcoin Policy Institute spearhead a lot of these efforts is really, really inspiring. It's really awesome to see. They're doing great work. And I think that Bitcoin's geopolitical importance will only grow. I think it's a matter of time before this working group is supposed to have their full plan ready about how we're going to actually buy more Bitcoin. So right now we're really in just like the bottom of the first inning for this thing. We're at the very beginning of kind of this global geopolitical Bitcoin race. The United States has fired off the starting gun, and now it's on us to start buying as much as we can, as fast as we can. And in the same vein, I think it's over the next several years, it's going to change the way the Bitcoin is traded. Right now, Bitcoin is traded as a very high risk, high beta asset. I believe over the next decade and a half to 2 decades, we're going to see a shift where Bitcoin trades well in good times and bad. During times of crisis, you'll want to own more Bitcoin. In really great times, you'll definitely want to own more Bitcoin, right? Whereas today, it's not that case, right? In bad times, you sell all your Bitcoin. At least this is the way the market treats it. It treats it like the NASDAQ. And in good times, you want to buy Bitcoin, right? I believe that over time, as Bitcoin's liquidity profile grows, as it moves from a $2 trillion asset, or like a $1.8 trillion asset now, to a $10 trillion asset, to a $20 trillion asset, then it will overtake the size of gold, to a $25 trillion asset, then it overtakes the size of the US Treasury market. I believe at that point, it'll shatter all correlations. Because Bitcoin will finally trade in line with what its monetary properties have allowed it to, which is the least correlated asset in the history of publicly traded markets, right? This absolutely scares monetary vehicle. People are trading it like the NASDAQ, and they shouldn't be. And I believe that once it usurps the size of not only the world's largest asset, but also the world's largest liquid market, which is the US Treasury market, I believe it'll shatter all those correlations because its monetary properties allow it to, and it will finally trade in line with what its monetary properties have allowed it to, which is this absolutely scarce, geopolitically neutral, sovereign bearer asset that can be traded anywhere around the world 24/7, 365 instantly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And again, very well explained and articulated. And I think, us Bitcoiners in the space who have been here for some time, we all recognize that, especially if you look at today's prices, Bitcoin is incredibly undervalued. And also in terms of adoption, Bitcoin is incredibly underutilized in a lot of parts of the world. And, sometimes I think as Bitcoiners, that can be quite frustrating at times as well. But I'm curious to hear from your perspective and from your experience, what do you think currently are the biggest blockers towards more global adoption of Bitcoin?
Yeah. I think a couple, I mean, the phrase Bitcoin is inevitable is correct, but that's not to say we can't have accelerants on the way that'll get us to where we're going quicker. For example, right, Trump being in office, that is an accelerant. If Kamala was in office, she would be cracking down on this thing hard, right? It'd be an avowedly anti-Bitcoin administration. So we got Trump in office. That's fantastic for Bitcoin. That's one accelerant. Another accelerant, is the fantastic work that David Bailey is doing over at Bitcoin Magazine. You don't often get a company who's basically solely dedicated to accelerating Bitcoin adoption and price appreciation as Bitcoin Magazine. And they're not doing it in a scammy way. They're not doing it in like an FTX Celsius way by spinning up a bucket shop and letting people trade Bitcoin at 100x leverage, only to come crashing down. They're doing it in a really legitimate way, right? Going after businesses with Bitcoin for Corporations, headed up by my friend Alan Helm. Literally going to companies, not just SMBs, but major enterprises are what they're focused on. Metaplanet, all these other businesses, right? They are basically orange pilling these companies, these public companies with huge balance sheets, to start buying Bitcoin. And as that grows in popularity, their growth will accelerate too. Also on the geopolitical front, right? David Bailey himself is visiting these world governments. He helped Trump do it. He's now over in Japan, spinning up Bitcoin Magazine Japan, working with them on Metaplanet, talking to companies, I think, like Nintendo. He's hinted at that a couple of times over the last few days. And so, companies like BM, companies like BTC Inc., headed up by David Bailey, I believe, that's another accelerant, right, in Bitcoin adoption. I think there's basically nothing that stands in Bitcoin's way. It's already reached escape velocity. It reached escape velocity once it had its first 1,000 or 10,000 users. Like, it was never going to be killed after that. Once you have like 100 nodes, it's over, right? 100 Bitcoin nodes, this thing's going to be running forever. It doesn't matter where you ban it or how you ban it or how hard the ban is. Bitcoin's never going to die. So it's just a function of like what's still standing in the way of bringing Bitcoin to where we know it's going to go. And for me, those things are just hostile countries that are still hostile toward Bitcoin despite everything that has happened. So your Chinas of the world, right, that still have banned Bitcoin mining. But even China now is rumored, because they follow Hong Kong's lead on a lot of this stuff. Hong Kong is basically the testing ground of what's going to happen in China in 5 years. And Hong Kong is very pro Bitcoin, right? And so I believe that China is gearing up to lift the ban on Bitcoin mining, become much more regulatorily friendly. That's not even a word. Create a much more, friendly and regulatory environment for these companies and for people to start owning Bitcoin, transacting in it, and building businesses around it, so they can be competitive with the United States, who has signaled that Bitcoin is a geopolitically important asset. China is beating us in terms of GDP. That doesn't necessarily matter, right? I hate GDP because when we focus on it as a country, we ignore things like family formation. We ignore things like Christian values, right? We ignore things like community. So we ignore the important things when we just take GDP as our bottom line. Here's what's important. So I hate it. But regardless, China's beating us in terms of like their absolute level of economic output. And we have a way of beating them now, right? By embracing Bitcoin as a nation, by cutting all the regulatory red tape, basically unleashing the American manufacturing center that was hollowed out by China. So now that we're doing all this stuff, now that Trump is doing all this stuff, right, with the economy and by embracing Bitcoin, it's basically China's move, right? Are you guys going to stagnate and let us walk all over you in the next 20 years? Because if there's one thing the United States knows how to do, it's how to win. Or are they going to embrace Bitcoin and then actually, try to stay in the race with us? So I think China, even the biggest kind of decelerant to Bitcoin growth and Bitcoin adoption, which was China, is now about to bow out of the race, step out, stop running in the opposite direction and try to catch up to the US. So I really, honest to goodness, right, in good faith, I can't say I see anything in Bitcoin's way. You could have said the SEC, you can't say that anymore, right? You could have said, unreasonable taxes on realized gains in Bitcoin. You can't say that anymore. That's being overhauled. So a lot of the things that used to be in Bitcoin's way are now in Bitcoin's favor. A lot of these agencies, these laws, these sovereign entities are in Bitcoin's favor. So in good faith, I can't really point out anything major that's now in Bitcoin's way, which is something beautiful about the time that we're living in.
Yeah, amazing. What I think is, really, really fascinating in this discussion as well is I think, as you mentioned, I think right now the overall global climate for Bitcoin is incredible. Like you said, it seems like ages ago now that even just the ETF was approved in the US, because like you said, for a while that was a limiting factor of how regulators would approach Bitcoin in the US. And now only, a bit over a year later, we're seeing it being fully adopted by the US government in the form of a strategic reserve. And as you mentioned, when the global game theory starts to play out, other nations, including China, will likely have to follow or be left behind. So it's an incredible time for Bitcoin. And that being said, I think, there's also a lot of opportunity within Bitcoin to advance the space, because I think, there's still a lot of areas where it seems underdeveloped, in terms of maybe usability, even education around people who still are unsure of what it is or why it's important. So I'm curious from your perspective, and I'm sure, of course, also your work at Theya and Horizon kind of factors into this, but what do you see as kind of the biggest opportunities in the Bitcoin space at the moment?
Yeah. Right now, we're living through a period where like the floodgates for the financialization of Bitcoin are totally open. If the United States wanted to, it could issue bit bonds. That's been one of the things that's really been trending on Twitter, is these bit bonds, the idea that you can back a bond with Bitcoin or issue bond with the purpose of using the proceeds to purchase Bitcoin. Very popular. We're seeing it now with Saylor, right? He's been doing it for 5 years. We're seeing it now with GameStop. They literally just said yesterday that they're issuing a $1.3 billion convertible senior note, or $1.3 billion worth of convertible senior notes with the purpose of accumulating Bitcoin. And guess what? They're issuing it at 0%. Saylor has basically always issued his converts at 0%. The United States could do something very similar. Hey, we're introducing a new bill, right? It's a 1-year bill. We are going to issue it at 0.5% or 0% because we are the least riskiest borrower in the world, because not only because everyone uses us, everyone uses treasuries as collateral, but also because we have a huge printer that we could use to back up your claim if we needed to. We could issue it at 0% and we could stack $10 billion worth of Bitcoin, $50 billion worth of Bitcoin, right? So that's huge. But stepping back, the financialization of Bitcoin has never been easier, right? Because all of these regulatory agencies that were formerly trying to prevent this from happening, the SECs of the world, that have prevented entities like Custodia Bank, who have been following literally everything that they've put forward, preventing them from offering like Bitcoin native financial services to TradFi customers. Those agencies are all out of the way now, right? SAB 121 was repealed. SAB 122 was put in its place. Banks can now custody Bitcoin freely. And so, Bitcoin-backed lending, Bitcoin being sold at banks, Bitcoin being custodied at banks, right? Banks having a self-custody option, right? All of these different things are now totally open. And so I think what I'm the most excited for, and this lines up a lot with what I'm working on, like at Theya, we've worked on an extremely modular multi-sig self-custody solution. That's modular in the sense that you could choose any of the wallets you want in there. You could choose your key structure, right? But also we're now building that product and scaling it out so that any financial advisor can use it. Any business can use it. Any Bitcoin exchange can use it, right? So we've built 4 different products, one for the individual, one for an individual working with their financial advisor and their financial advisor to do things like invoicing directly from there, to do things like taxes directly from there. We've made it so that these cumbersome things, like being a financial advisor that offers Bitcoin, are now easy. They're easier. They're actually easier, honestly. If I'm to compare solutions, they're easier than doing some of the TradFi stuff that they do, right? We've created a Bitcoin platform that makes it easier for financial advisors to help their clients own Bitcoin than it is for them to own the S&P 500. That's crazy, right? Same thing for businesses, right? We're lowering the barrier for businesses to adopt a corporate Bitcoin treasury strategy, right? We're making it so that you can pay out bonuses in Bitcoin instantly on a cadence that you set to any of your employees that you want. We've made it so that you can create different vaults and different departments, right? We've made it so that you can assign key managers and easily rotate them when there are changes at the C-suite level. We've done all these crazy things and we've made it into a technology that's basically plug and play. So what we're doing at Theya is we're basically taking a look at all of the major trends, where Bitcoin is now and where it's headed, what's popular and what's going to be popular. And we're building that technology to make it so that companies can just come to us, plug right in, and then have a seamless, simple Bitcoin strategy, whether you're a financial advisor, wealth manager, RIA, company, enterprise, Bitcoin exchange, all of it, or just an individual, right? That's what we've built at Theya. And then the other extremely cool thing we're building with Horizon, which you mentioned, is another really cool intersection of Bitcoin and TradFi. It's a step in the direction of making Bitcoin more financialized, creating like this complex financial instrument atop Bitcoin that lets you use your wealth in a different way. Basically what Horizon is, homeowners who have equity built up, $50,000 at the very least, they can now basically swap that home equity into Bitcoin, right? As long as they have $50,000 in home equity in their home, and most people do, right? Let's be real. Most people have a $50,000 down payment on their home, given how big houses are these days. The home I'm in right now is worth like $1.2 million, which is crazy. Basically, what Horizon allows you to do is diversify a portion of the value of your home into Bitcoin between 5 and 15%, whatever you'd like to do. It's not a loan. There are no interest payments. There are no interest charges. There's an origination fee. There's a closing fee, and that's it, right? Basically, what you can do, I'll give you an example. If you have a $1 million home, you want to put 10% of it into Bitcoin. You have at least $50,000 in equity. Basically, what you do, I'll explain the mechanics of it. You sell an option contract that's worth 10% of your home. You get 10% of your home's equity back in cash. You buy Bitcoin with it, hold it for a period of 10 years. And then after 10 years, you get to keep 90% of your Bitcoin stack. So in other words, instead of sitting in your home and having it appreciate by 4% every year, and at the end of 10 years, having it be like, $1.24 million, instead you have that full ownership of that $1.24 million home, plus Bitcoin that was $100,000 10 years ago, that's now probably $1 million plus, right? So, instead of your total appreciation being 40%, now it's 140%, right? So basically, like people who feel trapped in their homes, people who feel house poor, right? Basically, all they can pay for is their house. They cannot get anything else. You can go to Horizon, right? You can swap your home equity into Bitcoin. And then at the end of 10 years, you get to keep basically all of it, right? So it's a really neat way of taking like trapped capital, mobilizing it into Bitcoin, which is the best performing asset on Earth, a best performing major macro asset class on Earth, and then keeping basically all of it at the very end of it, right? So we're freeing trapped capital, which is crazy. Like this is a first of its kind solution. It's extremely unique. It's extremely cool, and we're launching in 10 states in the next 2 weeks, right? I'll have more to say about that on Twitter. Very, very shortly here, and the Horizon Twitter page is going to be lighting up like a Christmas tree. So that's what I'm really excited about is not just my companies, right? But the broader financialization of Bitcoin, these companies realizing they can leverage, public capital markets in order to raise equity and debt capital to buy Bitcoin. The United States probably very shortly realizing the exact same thing. Banks being able to custody Bitcoin on behalf of their products and offer structured Bitcoin financial products like Bitcoin-backed loans, Bitcoin-backed mortgages, and the like. And also tech companies like mine who are doing the very same thing, right? Bridging traditional finance and Bitcoin and allowing you to do cool things like free trapped equity or serve your clients as a financial advisor and own Bitcoin, or be a business or a Bitcoin exchange or an enterprise and hold Bitcoin in your balance sheet seamlessly. So these technologies, this interplay between Bitcoin and traditional finance and lending products, and not even lending products, but just broader financial products, is what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, it's incredible. Just hearing you explain those two companies, Theya and Horizon, it gets me super excited as well because, when I talk to people also, especially about Bitcoin, I feel like Bitcoin, it's only 16 years old and there's so much potential left in terms of development and usability and how we are going to interact with Bitcoin going towards the future. I think similar to the internet in the early stages of the internet, if you could have imagined now what came out of it, and it's only been around, mass commercially probably for 20, 30 years closely. The same is going to follow with Bitcoin, where I think as it gets adopted more globally, as we're seeing now, banks are going to adopt it. They're going to start to offer services and products around it. It's going to become a lot more usable for people to use because I think, the self-custody and usability aspect of it right now is also, there's a lot left to be desired, and why I think companies like they are great. So that's all to be said that I think over the next years, we're going to see, in my opinion, an insane amount of development in the Bitcoin space, and it's going to be, incredibly exciting. And I think one thing I also want to touch with you on, which I think is very important for, especially beginners in the space, it can be very easy to become misled by some of the other cryptos, let's say, out there, and to fall in that trap and to fall into those different marketing schemes. So what would you say to those people in terms of how you differentiate Bitcoin from the rest?
Yeah, so like one of the writing techniques that I've used since Nick and I began writing together for the Bitcoin layer, and that's carried over into Theya Research, which is the current research publication I'm helming over at Theya, is we always put crypto in quotation marks. The reason we do, and Nick explains it in his latest book, Bitcoin Age, which is awesome. I had the chance to edit it, is because crypto is short for cryptography, right? That's what it used to be short for. And now It's a short form of cryptocurrency, right? Which used to be only Bitcoin, right? It was just another way of classifying what Bitcoin was. Now, basically, crypto, meaning cryptocurrency, is just a way for scammers to gain affinity with Bitcoin, to convince people who are totally unassuming, who don't know the difference. And it makes me so angry that they do this. They say Bitcoin and crypto, right? Because they're trying to conflate these two things. Setting the record straight, right? Bitcoin is an absolutely neutral money, just like gold, right? Anyone can dig it up out of the ground. Same thing with Bitcoin. It's scarce, same as Bitcoin. Actually, Bitcoin is more scarce. It's absolutely scarce. We'll never find any more of it after 21 million. But similar to gold, and it's neutral, right? No one government controls it. No one entity controls it. And it's a bearer asset. Like you can only own your gold, you can own your Bitcoin, right? And it's unmanipulated. Obviously, gold has some manipulation issues in the futures market with paper gold. Bitcoin doesn't have nearly as bad of an issue with that, right? But basically, it is digital gold. Like a lot of people hate that analogy, but it is the best way of explaining what Bitcoin is, right? It's digital gold, but you can't hold it, right? It's gold on the internet, but you cannot hold it. And it's yours, right? All the same properties that you know and love about gold. Crypto is a completely different beast. It is a cabal of centralized VC-backed scams who are trying to gain affinity with Bitcoin, who have multi-million-dollar marketing budgets and are run by one centralized entity that pre-mines these tokens, right? So basically digs them up out of the ground and then sells them to people, right? Excuse me, which sounds a lot like a stock, what you do with a stock. Basically, when you are buying crypto, you are buying a stock in a company that doesn't do anything other than convincing other people to buy their stock, right? Which sounds like a Ponzi scheme because all of it is. There's no utility in any of these things. There's no use case in any of these things. Any posited use case or utility is total bull. You know, I don't want to say it on YouTube or Spotify, but that's exactly what it is, right? Even the biggest ones by market cap, Ethereum, if you just look at the ETH BTC pair, it's dead. It's completely dead. If you look at Bitcoin juxtaposed against anything else, they're all dying. Slow deaths, some faster than others, some much slower than others, like in the case of XRP. And you have extremely big ones that have insane marketing budgets, an insane amount of staff, like XRP. Right, XRP, Brad Garlinghouse. There's another name for him that's going around that I don't want to say on YouTube or Spotify. This guy is worse than Sam Bankman-Fried, in my opinion. He's awful. He's a terrible, terrible villain. Basically, what he did was he pre-mined the however many billion XRP, 100 billion XRP, and he's just dumping it over time onto the market. He's selling it to the market. And he's basically created this multi-billion dollar astroturfing campaign where he's basically creating fake support for XRP in order to gin up legitimacy. And he's doing that by obviously astroturfing. He's paying people and he's creating a coordinated network of bots, right? So you have astroturfed zealots and then you have bots who are all talking about XRP. And it's conning unsuspecting people, right, into buying this thing, thinking it's going to be the next Bitcoin or bigger than Bitcoin, right? I lose some of my professionalism when I talk about this because it makes me so angry, because it's so coordinated, it's so comprehensive in the way that they've created this fake scam token, convinced the public that it has any utility whatsoever, and then actually gained a market cap on that thing, actually gained market value. And they've done it by doing these things, right? Astroturfing and then creating a lot of bots. And then they've also done a couple of other things. Namely, they've created something called the National Cryptocurrency Association, basically a national think tank to teach the public about crypto. But there's one problem. It's a 501c4. And one thing about a 501c4 is that they allow for unlimited lobbying and anonymous lobbying to political candidates and politicians. So basically, this nonprofit think tank can funnel money into DC as much as they want to anyone they want without having to disclose it, in order to push forward their garbage unregistered security that has no value, 100 billion of which are owned by the guy who made it and is just dumping it onto the market, right? But he's doing this under the masquerade of it being a good faith organization to teach the public about crypto. It's not, right? And the other awful thing he did, which many people will forget about, is he gave $5 million to Greenpeace, right? Greenpeace was the organization that attacked Bitcoin with the Change the Code campaign. And it made that now viral image of a massive skull made out of motherboards of computers that had glowing Bitcoin eyes and had huge nuclear tower smokestacks coming off the top of it to try to convince people that Bitcoin was bad for the environment. We need to change the code. So at the same time that he's been scamming the public about XRP being in the same bucket as Bitcoin. You want to own some Bitcoin, but you also want to own a little XRP. At the same time he's been doing that garbage, he's been trying to undermine Bitcoin's legitimacy by doing this Change the Code campaign. Obviously, that fell in its face. You can't change Bitcoin's code. You're never going to. It's going to be proof of work until you die, Brad Garlinghouse, right? But on the flip side of that, he's trying to, affinity scam people into XRP, and it's working, and it's making me very mad. But these things are coming to light. I'm going to keep talking about it. I'm going to get other people to keep talking about it. I'm going to be spreading awareness about it because their reach with just giving people, like the amount of people on Twitter and YouTube who people respect and think they're like thought leaders, is much lower than you actually think. If you look at all the people promoting XRP, you have to realize that on the other side of that, either they actually believe this stuff and they're really, really stupid, or in many cases, like in the Patrick Bet-Davids of the world, they're getting paid millions of dollars in order to talk to their audience about XRP and how cool it is and how great it is, right? That's all going to come crashing down, right? The amount of people who will just throw away all of their values for a quick buck is astonishing, especially when it comes to XRP. And fun fact, Patrick Bet-David made his millions selling a pyramid scheme to teenagers, right? So this intelligent multimillionaire, billionaire, look at my big house, he's actually a con artist, right? And the other thing that they are doing, it escaped me. But XRP is terrible. They're horrible. They're bad people. They want to hurt you. They seek harm. They seek to do harm. They want to take your money. That's it. Right. So the biggest difference between Bitcoin and crypto is that crypto is a bunch of companies that are trying to swindle you out of your money by convincing you that it's similar to Bitcoin, which doesn't have a marketing department, doesn't have a budget, doesn't have any companies behind it. You can mine it on your own. You can't create Apple stock on your own, but you can mine Bitcoin on your own. That's the difference. Bitcoin is gold. Everything else is a company who's trying to scam you into thinking that their stock that they created out of thin air is just like gold too.
Agreed. And again, well said. I know we're running out of time here, but my final question for you, because I think this space outside of the whole shitcoin space, I think even entering Bitcoin, it can be overwhelming sometimes in terms of first figuring out how you buy it, then how you store it, learning about it. There's challenges, I think, that inhibit people to adopting Bitcoin and adopting Bitcoin well. So what advice would you have for newcomers who are entering the space in terms of, just general advice, but maybe also how to buy, hold, and maintain Bitcoin properly?
Yeah. So if you're going to get into Bitcoin, the first thing you should do is realize that none of what I'm giving you is investment advice. I get nothing from anyone buying Bitcoin. It's not in my interest to convince people to buy Bitcoin. It's in my interest to convince people of the value prop of Bitcoin. So the first thing I would tell people is go in, do some learning, right? Read some great books, read some dissenting books too, right? And then formulate your own opinion, right? Read some books from Bitcoin skeptics and read some books from people who've kind of evangelized Bitcoin, right? People who explain the value prop very clearly in a non-sensational way, right? Read things like The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, Masters and Slaves of Money. That's where I started. Read the Bitcoin Standard, read Bitcoin Age, right? Those are the books and pieces that I would direct people to try to formulate opinion on whether you think this thing is worthwhile or not. If you do decide to buy Bitcoin, do not touch Coinbase, do not touch Kraken, do not touch any of these other exchanges that have crypto, right, that offer that, because ultimately you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. If you're buying from an exchange that doesn't have proof of reserves, in other words, if you're buying from an exchange that doesn't tell you it has assets to match all of its liabilities, then you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, because FTX exploded. Before that, Mt. Gox exploded. More recently, WazirX in India exploded, all for the exact same reason, right? Their assets did not match their liabilities. When everyone came knocking and wanted their money, the entire scheme fell to the ground, right? Think bank run. Everyone knows what a bank run is, or at least they've heard of it. So if you're going to buy Bitcoin, buy it from a Bitcoin-only exchange that has proof of reserves. The only one that I can think of is River, right? Not an advertisement for them. I love that company. I've known a lot of the guys there for a pretty long time. I'm good friends with them. They're the only Bitcoin-only exchange that comes to mind that has proof of reserves. If you're going to buy Bitcoin, buy it from over there. And then custody it on your own, right? River has multi-sig, self-custody, proprietary, but they also encourage users to take it into their own custody. Even though they have a custody solution where they're not lending out customers Bitcoin, they are recognizing the importance of self-custody. And so they have tools and materials for you to learn about self-custody and then begin doing it. If you're a more seasoned user, you can custody on a hardware device, right? This is what self-custody will look like, not on some kind of mobile wallet on your phone. Do not do that. Custody it on something like this, right? A cold card queue. If this looks too complicated for you, you can buy a Foundation passport, right? From my good friends over at Foundation, Zach and the crew, right? Everyone knows how to use one of these. This looks like a phone from the 2000s, right? So buy a Bitcoin-only hardware wallet, buy Bitcoin on a Bitcoin-only exchange, store it on a Bitcoin-only hardware device, or use a multi-sig solution, right? If you're not comfortable with having it on here because you're afraid of losing it, enter into a collaborative multi-sig setup, right? With somebody like Unchained, they're fantastic. With somebody like Casa, they're also fantastic, right? Or someone like Theya, right? My company. I always mention the two incumbents first whenever I mention Theya, because ultimately we're competitors, but we're all trying to do the same thing, right? I'm friends with the guys over at Unchained. We work with them at the Bitcoin layer. I'm friends with Nick over at Casa. We are competitors, but we're friends because we're all trying to achieve the exact same thing, which is helping people self-custody their Bitcoin and eliminate single points of failure. So that's where I would start, right? All the way from learning materials to custody. That's what I would do. If you are going to do this, I'm not encouraging anybody to do this. I think chances are people who are watching the Bitcoin Journeys podcast already have an interest in Bitcoin and know these things. But in case you aren't, in case you're brand new, that's where I would start.
Awesome. Great advice. And agree. I think having those outlets, especially I think in the US, the infrastructure is a bit more built, of course, than in other countries. But I think globally you do have solutions, especially on the custody side. As you mentioned, the things like Bitcoin hardware wallets, like the ones from Foundation Devices or Cold Card, are great options for people. And my advice also is to take it step by step. I think people can get overwhelmed by the scope of doing something like that, especially because taking full responsibility of your money is not something that people are typically very used to. But it's definitely a worthwhile venture, and it's not as scary as it seems as well, I think. So that being said, Joe, I really appreciate your time today. Lastly, anything else you want to point my listeners to, or how they can reach out to you or get in touch with you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on, man. This is really fun. I love shows like this. So keep up the good work that you're doing. And for the people listening, if you haven't already, give this guy a 5-star rating on Spotify, wherever you're listening to it. Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, if you're on Fountain, right? Do that first and foremost, right? Because, people like you, podcasts like this are what ultimately drive Bitcoin adoption from the ground up, right? So keep doing what you're doing, show them some support. If you want to find more of my stuff, you could find me on X at Joe Consorti, just the same way the name is spelled in the title. I post all of my research, all of my findings, all of my thoughts and musings over there. You could also check out Theya. I have research that I do over there. You could check out Horizon. It is, again, this really cool solution. If you own a home and you're having FOMO about Bitcoin, you'll probably want to check this thing out, right? If you're on the fence about something like a HELOC or any other kind of loan, you can breathe easy knowing that we don't have that, right? We have this extremely unique tool that allows you to diversify home equity into Bitcoin with no payments. And check out the Bitcoin layer first. And, lastly, right? If you are from an institution as well, we're launching a new product called TBL Research in the coming days. Well, it's already live actually for institutional clients, right? That gives you actionable trade signals about Bitcoin. And that's basically everything.
Awesome. Joe, I'll put all that in the show notes for my listeners as well. But again, really appreciate the insights and thanks again for all the work that you do in the Bitcoin space.
Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it.